Hi everybody, Aldo Psych here. Going to do a little talk on the 7 Sins of Memory by Daniel L. Schachter. Book is from 2001, 2002. I'm just going to go over my notes on it. And, as always, sometimes my notes may not be perfect, but I think they're pretty good. You can always just refer to the book, though, if you want to go right to the source. And there are 7 sins of memory that are listed. He says memory's malfunctions can be divided into 7 fundamental transgressions or sins, as he calls them. And he lists them as transience, absent-mindedness, blocking, misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and then an interesting one, persistence. Okay, he breaks the sins down into sins of omission and sins of commission. So transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking are sins of omission. This is where we fail to bring to mind a desired fact, event, or idea. First one, transience, refers to a weakening or loss of memory over time. So vividness of memory declines rapidly over the first 3 months, followed by a more gradual decline over the next 3 months. And then we rely on our memories for the gist of what happened or what usually happens, an attempt to reconstruct the details by inference and even sheer guesswork. So episodes and incidents we discuss and rehearse are protected at least partially from transience. And I think most of us probably think of transience when we think of our memory concerns. Over time, the memory degrades. What's interesting is, as he mentioned, we remember the gist, kind of like the main components, but we kind of forget little details. And what we might do, and again, when I just so you remember, my notes are my notes, and sometimes I add in my own thoughts as well. And in this case, I'm throwing in the term confabulation. A lot of times, people will confabulate. I'm thinking back to a memory and I remember the gist, and sometimes I'll fill in the little details unconsciously, and maybe the details are incorrect, but they kind of make sense or they fit. Okay, so people tend to do that. I do that. We do that. The next sin is absent-mindedness, which refers to a breakdown at the interface between attention and memory. So lapses of attention that result in failing to remember information that was either never encoded properly or at all, or is available in memory, but is overlooked at the time we need to retrieve it. He mentions prospective memory, remembering to do things in the future. The best prospective memory triggers tend to be highly distinctive cases that have few other associations in long-term memory. What's interesting, he mentions the part about attention, and I can just remember working as a school psychologist, assessing students, and if their attention isn't there, well, their memory's not going to be there. If you can get them to attend to the task, then their memory scores are going to go up. So it's kind of hand in hand there. If you want to remember something, well, let's make sure that you're paying attention to what you remember. That's gonna help. The other sin of omission is blocking. So blocking is a thwarted search for information we're trying to retrieve. I think of this as kind of the tip of the tongue syndrome. You have the information, but you can't quite bring it out. It's just like on the tip of your tongue. So blocking occurs most often with people's names. So an occupation calls up associations, attributes, unlike a name. So you can remember, you see somebody, you know that person. Can't remember the name, but yeah, the person works in that department, and it was, 3 years ago, and she told me this, and she told me that, blah, 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 but you can't remember the name. Sometimes proper name anomia is associated with damage to the front of the left temporal lobe. That's mentioned in the book, but I think in most cases, it's just that simple blocking. Okay. Now the next 4 sins are sins of commission. This is misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and then persistence. Commission, there's some form of memory is present, but it's either incorrect or unwanted. So the sin of misattribution involves assigning a memory to the wrong source. When memory binding fails, attributes of a particular person, gluing together the various components of an experience into a unitary whole, misattribution may occur. I think I took that word for word, but I'm not sure. So, memory conjunction error, combining 2 people into one. So, for example, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Albert become Mr. Wilbert. So that happens sometimes where we combine two sources. Now the hippocampus, one little structure in the brain, it's kind of like a memory relay station. The hippocampus plays an important part in binding. Now this is kind of interesting. Witnesses tend to rely on relative judgments. So they choose, say we're talking about a police lineup, for instance. So they will choose the person who, relative to the other people in the lineup, look most like the suspect, even though the suspect is not in the lineup. So if I look someone like the suspect and the other people in the lineup don't, I might get fingered for being the culprit there. So you can see that some of these memory issues can have some real life and significant ramifications. The sin of suggestibility also has some significant real life ramifications. This refers to memories that are implanted as a result of leading questions, comments, or suggestions. So, suggestibility is closely related to misattribution in the sense that the conversion of suggestions into inaccurate memories must involve misattribution. However, misattribution often occurs in the absence of overt suggestion, making suggestibility a distinct sin of memory. That's according to Schechter. Now, leading questions can contribute to eyewitness misidentification, and suggestive psychotherapeutic procedures may foster the creation of false memories. And aggressive interviewing of preschool children can result in distorted memories of alleged abuses by teachers and others. Misleading suggestions can create false memories of an event even when people recall that the misinformation was suggested. So, we talk about aggressive interviewing of preschool children. If you're old enough to have been around in the 80s, there was the McMartin preschool incident and trial that went on for years. This is kind of like a prime example of that aggressive, suggestive interviewing. So I'll just ask you, if you're interested, go ahead and look that one up on Google. It's a fascinating story. The trial went on for years, cost a lot of money, and ultimately led to no convictions. But go ahead and look that one up. Now, back to my notes. Sin of bias, that reflects the powerful influences of our current knowledge and beliefs on how we remember our past. So, people's views on political issues have changed over time, often recall incorrectly past attitudes as highly similar to present ones. So, unless there's a good reason to believe that your views on capital punishment have changed, you're likely to assess your present opinion and your views and assume you felt the same way 5 years ago. Looking at my notes, and I just read that a little bit. But so consistency and change bias may help to reduce cognitive dissonance. I'll let you look up cognitive dissonance. Hindsight bias, the tendency to see an outcome as inevitable in retrospect. So we reconstruct the past to make it consistent with what we know in the present. Okay, so we have these little, it's almost like a little defense mechanism that's in operation here. The one that's most interesting, the sin, that's really most interesting to me is the last one, which he calls the sin of persistence. So I don't, I guess it's a memory sin, but the sin of persistence entails repeated recall of disturbing information or events that we would prefer to banish from our minds. Okay, so a little bit different than the others. Actually, a lot different than the others. So weapon focus is when a victim remembers the features of the perpetrator's weapon. So for example, a gun instead of the perpetrator. So if you're being held at gunpoint, your focus, your attention might be actually on that weapon, on that gun, and not on the perpetrator's face at all. In fact, I had a friend that was held at gunpoint, and he kind of went through that scenario. He looked at the gun; it was a revolver. He could see the bullets, in the chamber there. Doesn't really remember too much about the individual that held him up. Now, the emotionally arousing object draws attention automatically. So people tend to remember more from positive and negative photographs than neutral ones. So reminders of unpleasant experiences can induce us to engage in counterfactual thinking, as he puts it. Thinking about what might have or should have been. For example, not buying or selling a stock, and you ruminate about that. Okay. An attitude of not living in the past helps with the sin of persistence. Now, patients suffering from depression are especially prone to persistence. Disclosing difficult experiences to others should not be confused with ruminating, and disclosing can have positive effects. People with persistence often suffer from overgeneral memories. So, for example, I've always been a failure. Intrusive recollections are usually visual, although they can occur in any of the senses. And trying to avoid thinking about a traumatic event in its immediate aftermath can lead to a rebound effect and make it worse. So exposure therapy has produced good reductions in intrusive memories. And when I think of the sin of persistence, I think of PTSD. And there's an awful lot of information out there now on trauma and how to treat trauma. In fact, I just went through a online seminar about trauma, so I'll probably present something in that regard in the very near future. So it's kind of interesting, though. He has those 7 sins of memory. The last one, persistence, is really like not forgetting, but it's like wanting to forget, or at least see if you can reduce the emotional charge that's going on, because you are constantly reliving what traumatic events you may have gone through. So we'll talk about that in the future. Anyway, for the time being, I'm done. Just remember, this is for informational purposes only. I went through my notes. Sometimes my notes might be a little off, so it's probably best if you go ahead and get the book and read it yourself. Thanks for watching.